What happens when allies pretend to be idiots and the Germans fall for every fake move? When the truth came out, it wasn't anger that reigned at Wehrmacht headquarters. It was silence. I didn't build rafts to be famous. I built them because I was tired of watching boys sink like bricks. Arms flailing, boots filled with water, screaming for mamas they hadn't seen in years. That sound stays with you. I was 29 when I designed my first low-profile landing raft. Baton Rouge born, shipyard raised. Before the war, I patched hulls with my old man and uncles who knew boats better than they knew church. We built stuff that had to float. Not maybe float. Had to. So when they shipped me over to England in '43, cold mud, thick fog, officers talking like they were in a Shakespeare play, I knew I wasn't here to carry crates. I had something better to offer, something useful. And just my luck, I got placed in logistics, which is military for move this pile of stuff from here to over there and don't ask questions. We were stationed near Portsmouth, real industrial place. Smelled like oil and burnt toast. You could hear drills from the shipyards in the mornings and the cussing of mechanics in the evenings. My unit shared a prefab with busted windows and no heat. But we had coffee. Terrible, chalky, instant British-issued coffee, and I drank it every morning at the same table where I sketched out my raft idea on the back of a ration form. It wasn't fancy, it wasn't big, but it worked on paper. Low draft, steel frame base, sealed canvas, stretched tight, coated in grease and wax to repel water. Could fit 4 men or a wounded soldier in gear. No engine, just quiet paddles. Light enough to carry by 2, strong enough to keep someone alive. That was the point. Keeping someone alive. First guy I showed it to was a captain named Horner. Tall, stiff, mustache that looked like it belonged to another man entirely. He glanced at my sketch like it was a smudge on his lunch plate. "Corporal Brown," he said slowly, "we already have landing craft. Proper ones. Built by proper contractors." I told him I wasn't trying to replace Higgins' boats, just offering a smaller option, something for tight canals, marshes, places where a motor gets you spotted before you even hit land. He nodded like I was done talking. I wasn't, so I asked if I could demo a prototype. He folded the paper and handed it back. "Perhaps next war." You think that hurt? Sure it did. But I was raised by people who didn't have the luxury of quitting when folks said no. So I built it anyway. Got scrap from the dock workers, half of them black guys from Norfolk and Philly, good men with calloused hands and quiet laughs. They called me Dock Floater. After word got around I was building a boat in the barracks yard. I worked at night, kept the noise down, sewed the canvas by hand, stitched the seams with fishing line dipped in wax, and on a freezing Sunday morning, we took it out to the edge of the harbor. Just me, a fellow tech named Joe Atkins, and Private Hernandez, who was brave, or dumb enough to get in first, and damn if it didn't float. Smooth, balanced, silent. We paddled out 40 yards and back. Did it again and again. Word spread fast. By Monday, 10 more guys wanted to try it. That's when command showed up, not to ask questions, to shut it down. A lieutenant named Frazier came stomping down with 2 MPs, like I had started a revolution with rope and cloth. "You built an unauthorized watercraft?" he asked, holding my sketch like it was evidence from a crime scene. I told him it was a prototype, a demonstration, a possible life-saving tool. He told me it was a distraction from official duties. They took the raft apart right there, tore it up with bayonets. like it was dangerous to float. I stood there watching, not angry, not shocked, just tired. Tired of seeing smart, useful things get stomped out by people too proud to listen. The kicker? Next week, same officers approved a British design that looked mighty familiar. Thin, canvas-sided, two-man paddles. For marsh operations. Designed by a lieutenant colonel's nephew. I laughed. Not loud, just enough to remind myself I still had air in my lungs. Joe looked at me and said, "That's yours, right?" I nodded. "But theirs got a patent," he said. "Yeah, theirs got a patent. Mine got torn apart in the mud." Later that night I sat alone in the mess tent with a notebook and half a pencil, writing down everything I remembered. Every measurement, every stitch pattern, every note. And at the top I wrote, "They can take it from the yard. They can't take it from my head." That notebook stayed with me. Through France, through Belgium, through the noise. You might ask why I kept going, why I didn't just shut up and do the job. Because I saw too many black soldiers, cooks, drivers, stevedores, ammo haulers get used up and buried with nobody remembering they even existed. I figured the least I could do was build something that gave somebody a chance. Not a medal, just a chance. That was my war, not the one on the posters, the one under the posters, behind the tents. In the quiet spaces where real things get built by people who don't have permission. And that was just the beginning, because what happened next? Well, let's just say it changed everything. You don't want to miss how that turned out. What happened next changed everything. You don't want to miss how that turned out. I never expected applause, but I didn't expect to be laughed out of the damn room either. See, when you're a corporal in logistics and you happen to be black, you learn to keep your voice even. Eyes forward, speak only when asked. They teach you that back home too, especially in Louisiana. Especially when your daddy's overalls were worth more than his vote. But on that Thursday morning in March, I walked into that operations tent with a satchel full of test data and a straight back. That's where I made my mistake. I thought the truth was enough. It was supposed to be a tech review. Just a small room, couple of junior officers, maybe one guy with stripes actually paying attention. Instead, I walk in, and it's 4 captains, major, and some civilian from Washington wearing cologne like he was going to a nightclub. Not a war. They had a big chart on the wall marked Operation X. I didn't know the name, just the outline. Somewhere wet, fast, hostile. Nothing we weren't used to. "Corporal Brown, correct?" said Captain Flynn, not looking up. "Yes, sir." "You're here about the paddle boat." That's when the chuckling started. I paused, placed my folder on the table. "With respect, sir," I said, "it's a low-noise, low-profile, field-deployable amphibious raft." Flynn cut me off. Yes, the quiet raft." "We've heard. Let's keep this quick." So I opened the folder. Test logs, weather reports, load simulations, photos. Nothing fancy, just results. I even had a list of men who volunteered for field testing. Mostly porters and drivers, guys nobody usually asked for much. They all signed up because they'd seen one too many friends go under in the channel or the marshes. This raft could have made a difference. Flynn skimmed one page and set the whole folder aside like a paper napkin. "We appreciate your enthusiasm, Brown, but this operation requires equipment that's been vetted." That's when I knew. None of them read a single damn page. The civilian leaned back, arms crossed. "Tell me, Corporal, what's your engineering background?" "I built landing craft at Delacroix Shipworks for 6 years, sir." He raised his eyebrows. Not military engineering. No, sir. Real-world engineering. The kind that keeps steel afloat. That line didn't land the way I wanted, but it was the truth. Afterward, they thanked me for my time, and dismissed me before the coffee even got cold. I left the tent, walked 20 yards into the fog, and let me tell you something. I didn't feel embarrassed. I felt insulted. Later that day, I got reassigned out of the test unit, back to Crate Detail, Transport Corps, 18th Depot. 2 hours east. No warning, no explanation, just orders. That's how they move you when you ask too many questions without the right kind of uniform. The depot was a ghost town built out of mud and tin. I shared a shack with 6 other guys, none of whom spoke above a whisper unless they were cursing the chow or the cold. We worked in shifts, unloading crates of ammo and folding maps that didn't have names on them, just symbols and lines that meant danger, landmine, or don't come back. My hands stopped sketching for a while. It was hard to draw after lifting crates for 12 hours and sleeping on a cot that smelled like rust. But I kept that notebook in my jacket. Every day. One night, while I was helping patch a busted truck axle in the yard, I heard someone shout my name. "Brown, you got a visitor." Didn't happen much. I wiped off the grease and walked up to the gate. There stood Sergeant Mallory, the old motor pool sergeant from Portsmouth. White guy, mid-40s, loud voice, hands like anvils. We weren't friends. We just respected each other's work. That meant something. "You still got that little raft idea?" he asked. I paused. "Why?" He looked around. "Because my boys are shipping out next week, and intel says they're getting dropped near a marshland." He didn't have to say more. He'd seen the mock-up. Helped me tie the frame together once. I nodded. I got the specs. We worked 3 nights straight. Borrowed tools, scrap canvas, spare tubes. Mallory didn't ask for permission. He just gave me the corner of his garage and told the guards to keep walking. By the end of night 3, we had 2 field-ready rafts. Didn't look like much, but I knew they'd float. Mallory gave me a look I won't forget. "You know they'll never thank you for this, right?" I smiled. "I'm not doing it for thanks." And sure enough, the next week those boys went out. No fanfare, no headline, just boots on the ground in a place that would have swallowed 'em whole if not for what we built. They came back soaked, scratched up, hungry, but alive. Mallory caught me behind the mess tent that night. Both rafts made it. One took a hit, but it stayed afloat. I nodded. Good. Then he said something strange. "You know, some of the brass are starting to ask who built those things." I froze. He shook his head. "Don't worry. I didn't say a word." I walked away that night with 2 things. A busted thumb from wrenching too hard, and the smallest piece of something I hadn't felt in weeks. Validation, not from a medal, not from a salute, but from the fact that what I built, what they laughed at, kept men from going under. That's enough to make a man keep going. This was the turning point. Everything they mocked came back to bite. Stick around because the fallout? That's where the real fight begins. The story is just beginning. If you are intrigued by how genuine ideas overcome ridicule and bureaucracy, subscribe to ensure you don't miss the continuation. In the comments, please share your thoughts. Do you believe that childish ideas can change the course of history? They don't break you all at once. No, the system has more style than that. They chip at you, quietly, with paperwork, with reassignments, with polite smiles and closed doors, and by the time you realize you're being erased, It's already halfway done. That's where I was. April 1944, 3 months out from something big, though nobody said a word. All we knew was that more maps were being folded, more shells were being counted, and nobody laughed as much at night. And me. They had me in boot detail. Not even crate work anymore. Just brushing, oiling, lining up rows of combat boots for units shipping out. They didn't say why. No write-up, no reprimand. Just a note posted outside the mess tent. Corporal A. Brown reassigned to quartermaster cleaning rotation. I remember standing there, reading it in the rain. Nobody looked at me. Nobody needed to. They knew. The next morning I showed up in the quartermaster tent, picked up a brush, and got to work. You want to know the insult? Most of those boots still had sand in them, from North Africa. Men who wore them had marched through heat and flies and came back with stories nobody wanted to hear. And now I was scrubbing their dried sweat off the soles like it never happened. Private Clark, a young white kid from Ohio, leaned over his crate and said, "Tough break, man." I shrugged. Just boots. Just dirt. But inside I wasn't fine. Inside I was carrying the weight of 2 rafts that worked, a dozen volunteers who'd bet their lives on me, and a system that didn't want any of it on paper. But that's the thing about a fire. It doesn't die easy. One afternoon, just after I'd finished a row of soaked boots, Sergeant Mallory came in, still motor pool, still loud. He looked around, saw me, and blinked like I wasn't supposed to be real. "Boot detail. You?" I gave him the brush I was holding. Apparently, I'm better at shine than design. He didn't laugh, just set a note in my hand. "Read that, then burn it." It wasn't even folded, just grease-stained paper with a list of coordinates, 2 names, and a time. And at the bottom, in pencil, "Tell nobody." That night I walked 2 miles past the depot fence, down a dirt road with no name. By the time I got to the barn on the edge of the airfield, it was already half-lit. Inside were 2 officers in plain fatigues, no patches, no flags. Just canvas, mud, and a single question. "You the one who built the rafts?" I nodded. No rank, no salute, just eyes. They asked about flotation under rifle fire, handling under load, assembly time. I answered everything without hesitation, because it was mine, because I'd lived with it, because I wasn't guessing. They didn't say much back. Just, "We are pulling men out of a spot with no boats. If we send yours and they hold, we'll talk again." By the end of that week, I was back in the motor pool. Not on the books, not officially. But I had my corner again. 3 volunteers helped me piece together what we had left. Strips of steel frame, canvas stitched from salvaged tents, barrels cut and capped for flotation. We worked at night. No lights, no noise, no names. I didn't even tell Clark. Then it rained, hard, everything flooded. The back lot was a swamp by morning. One of the guys, Tommy, slipped and busted his chin open on a wrench. I carried him to the aid tent myself. While he was getting patched up, I noticed the bulletin board outside. 2 of the boys from Mallory's unit, missing. Failed recovery. Presumed drowned. That's when I snapped. Walked straight to the field tent, slapped my original specs on the table, and stared down the captain who once laughed at me during that briefing. He looked up slow, said nothing. I pointed to the names. Those men didn't have a raft. You made sure of it. He just sighed, like he was tired of being wrong, but too proud to admit it. "Orders are orders, Corporal." I walked out. Not defeated. Clear. That's the difference. See, by now I knew something they didn't. If you build for recognition, you break. But if you build for the boys who actually bleed in those boots, you keep going. A week later, a lieutenant I'd never met handed me a field note. 3 lines, coordinates, weather conditions, duration. Below it, approved for field test. No attribution. They weren't giving me credit, but they were giving me access. I'll take it because I knew what that meant. By sundown, I had 2 new rafts strapped to the underbelly of a truck bound east. No fanfare, no briefing, no camera. Just me, a wrench, and the sound of boots across gravel. That night I sat alone in the motor pool. Didn't sleep, didn't eat, just watched the door. And sometime after midnight, Mallory walked in, soaked, coughing and smiling like he'd seen a ghost. "They made it," he said. "Your rig. Held up just fine. Pulled 3 out." I didn't say anything for a while, then, "You tell command." He shook his head. "They don't need to know. The men do." That was enough, because out there, in the mud and dark, the difference between dead and breathing wasn't protocol. It wasn't rank. It was steel, canvas, rope, and someone who cared enough to build it, even when they told him to stop. This was the moment it all cracked. They tried to shut it down, but the field had its own truth. Stick around. The consequences are coming, and not everyone's ready. There's something about a man getting credit he didn't ask for. It sticks to him. Quiet, heavy, not like a trophy. More like a shovel you didn't drop. That's what it felt like the morning they called me in. No rank on the door, just a fold-up table and 5 chairs that didn't match. One guy wore a tie too tight for his neck. Another wore boots too clean for the ground. The others looked like they hadn't seen a field since basic. They didn't say hello, just slid a sheet across the table. "Corporal Brown," one of them said, "can you walk us through what this is?" I didn't need to read it. I'd drawn it. It was my raft, cleaned up, stamped, and now labeled Field Alternative Amphibious Load System. You know what that means? They gave it a name, but not a name that had mine on it. So I started talking. Not loud, not proud, just facts. Weight ratios, load stability, fabric tension under water pressure, deployment speed, assembly under duress. I spoke like a man who knew the thing because he'd bled into it. They nodded, took notes. The guy in the tie kept tapping his pen like he was waiting for me to say something wrong. Finally, one of them leaned in, asked real soft, "Why didn't you go through standard channels?" I smiled. "Just a little." I did, twice. And both times it got shelved. They didn't argue, because they knew how the system worked. They just didn't expect someone who cleaned boots to outlast it. That week, things shifted. Not officially, not out loud, but the signs were there. Suddenly, I had access to toolkits I didn't ask for. A shed with a working bench, and real steel stock. An advisor title with no paperwork. And a visit from 2 engineers with accents thicker than oatmeal, who introduced themselves as design consultants from some office in Manchester. They'd been assigned to optimize my platform. Translation: they were going to repackage my raft and make sure it looked like it came from the right office. The younger one, maybe 26, pulled me aside. "Truth be told," he said, "we've been reading your specs for months, and just weren't allowed to say anything." That hit strange. Not bad, just strange. Like watching someone else carry your toolbox. Back at the depot, the motor pool boys started whispering. "Brown's getting promoted." "Nah, he's getting investigated." I didn't answer either way, because both were half right. One night, Sergeant Mallory sat with me under the awning during a hard rain. We shared stale coffee and watched the trucks sink an inch into the mud every time they turned. He looked over and said, "Funny thing, you do a thing right, and folks get nervous." I nodded. It's like they think results come with a tax. The next morning it got real. 2 MPs showed up by my rack, not angry, just quiet. Told me I was being temporarily transferred to the shoreline logistics team, something called wet cargo prep. Didn't sound like much, but I knew what it meant. They were putting me closer to the edge, closer to whatever was coming. I arrived at the new camp to find half-constructed docks, busted cranes, and rows of olive-green crates marked with red chalk. Everything smelled like rust and salt. Men moved fast, didn't speak much. Every hour a horn sounded and everyone stopped to check the tide. It was serious business. And my raft. There it was, stacked 5 high, modified, but mine, right down to the triple-stitched seam near the bowline. I ran my fingers across it like it was a face I hadn't seen in years. The officer in charge, a short man named Fields, spotted me. "You Brown?" "Yes, sir. You're on test detail. Raft Group 3. I followed him through the maze of crates and cables. We stopped at a half-flooded dock where a group of men were loading gear onto a raft. I stepped in to help. Instinct, not order, and caught one of them about to overload the left side. "Careful," I said. "That side pulls if it's front-loaded." He blinked. "How do you know?" "I built it." For the first time in months, someone didn't laugh. He just moved the crate. We launched 2 rafts that morning, then 2 more. None flipped, none dragged. Everyone came back wet but floating. By evening, someone handed me a clipboard. Not with orders, with feedback, questions, how to secure the canvas faster, how to improve paddle grip. Could the rig carry a medic kit and stretcher? I answered everything. They wrote it all down. That night I walked the dock alone. Fog rolled in heavy, sea thick with silence, and I thought, this is how change actually happens. Not in headlines, not in parades, but in the hands of tired men doing hard work with something that finally works back. 2 days later, I was called to the officer's tent again. Different faces this time. Fewer pens. Major Barnes, older, gravel voice, leaned forward and said, "Corporal, we're assigning 5 more units of your rig for operational trial. No names attached, but it's going live." He looked at me long, like a man trying to decide whether to apologize or congratulate. He chose neither. Just said, "You did good. Quiet good. That's the kind that lasts." I walked out of that tent, not proud, settled. That's a word folks don't use enough. Not angry, not vindicated. Settled, because I knew what they didn't say. Those rafts were going somewhere, and somebody's son was going to make it across because of it. Not because I demanded it, not because I marched for it, because I built it anyway. Truth made its way through. Quietly, but fully. And now the system had to reckon with what it tried to bury. Stick around. The fallout is only getting started. You ever stand in a room full of men who act like you're not there until something breaks? That was me. May 1944. 3 weeks before the big one, though none of us called it that yet. We just knew something heavy was coming. The kind that made officers walk faster and mail get delivered slower. I'd been moved again, this time to an airfield depot with priority clearance. They didn't say why. They never did. just tossed me a pass and pointed toward a hangar that used to be a cow barn. Inside, crates stacked to the ceiling, sandbags along the back wall, and a long wooden table covered in green canvas. Maps, tools, blueprints, all laid out like a body waiting to be stitched up. In the middle of it all, my raft. Well, their version of it. Stiff canvas, bolt seams. Improved design, they called it. It looked good. Problem was, it didn't float. The officer in charge, Major Elkins, met me at the door. He didn't shake my hand, just pointed at the raft. It's listing left under even weight. Can't figure out why. I walked up, ran my fingers along the seams. Didn't take long. Their bolts are too tight. Pulls the canvas uneven. He looked confused. But the spec says, "Spec's wrong. Canvas stretches in water. You over-tighten it dry, it curls when wet." He blinked. "How do you know that?" "I sewed the first one in a flood basin with one hand and a tent needle." He stared, then turned to the rest of the room. "Everyone out." 10 minutes later, it was just me and him. No clipboard, no rank between us. Just the raft and the silence of a man rethinking what he's been taught. He spoke first. "We had a factory in Kent produce 100 of these. They'll all fail. You sure?" "Only if water behaves the way it always has." He didn't argue, didn't defend, just sat down on a crate and took out a pencil. Then helped me fix it. So I did. We stayed there till midnight. I showed him how to pre-soak the canvas, how to run a zigzag stitch that gave it flex under pressure, how to cut baffles that didn't rattle in wind. He listened, took notes, even asked if I had drawings. I didn't. I had memory, experience, and a way of knowing what would hold. Not because a chart said so, but because I'd already seen it not hold. Next morning they ran the test. Same loading drill, same equipment, same crew. Raft held, no lean, no drag. When it came back to shore, one of the men on board, a medic, tapped it twice like it was a friend, and then said, "We should have had this 6 months ago." Nobody disagreed. After that, the quiet respect started creeping in. Men nodded when I passed. Officers called me Brown instead of Son or You There. I even got a cot with a mattress. Not much, but enough to feel like I wasn't just passing through somebody else's plan. Then came the meeting. Big one. Real chairs, real coffee, no jokes. 4 officers. 1 from engineering, 1 from transport, and 2 from up top. The kind who wear dress uniforms in the middle of nowhere. Major Elkins introduced me. "Gentlemen, this is the man responsible for your field rig stability." One of them raised an eyebrow. "I thought R&D designed that." They tried. He handed over a file, photos, test results, deployment notes, all tagged Brown Variation Operational Revision 3. I didn't say anything. Didn't have to, because for the first time they said it in the room. They didn't call it mine, but they brought me in to fix it. That's more honest than most ever get. By the end of the week, I was training teams, 6-man crews, night shifts, shoreline deployments, every raft packed with medical gear, communication kits, and dry rations. They didn't even question the design anymore. They just used it. That's all I ever wanted. Not a plaque, not a salute. Just a tool that worked, and didn't care what color your hands were. On my last day at the depot, one of the crew chiefs came by. A big guy from Jersey, all forearms and engine grease. He handed me a patched-up raft tag. One of mine. Stained, ripped, barely readable. "Thought you might want to keep it?" I nodded. He paused, then said something that stuck. They might never say it right. But we know. That night I sat on the edge of the airstrip, watched the wind push clouds like they were late for something, and I thought about every door that closed, every laugh in the room, every boot I cleaned, and I felt one thing: stillness. Because the work made it through, because the men who needed it had it, and because sometimes that's how real things move. Not in parades, not in announcements, but in the silence after they stop asking if it's possible and start asking how to pack it. They tried to bury the man, but they couldn't bury what he built. Because when lives were on the line, it wasn't a name that floated, it was the work. Some stories don't get medals. They get misfiled. They get boxed up in the back room. They get called field improvisations or temporary measures. And you learn to live with that. But just because something isn't written down doesn't mean it didn't happen. Sometimes the proof shows up soaked, half-broken and still breathing. June 6th, 1944. They called it D-Day later. At the time, it was just a cold gray morning, and a sky full of birds we didn't launch. I wasn't in the first wave, wasn't even supposed to be near the beach, but plans have a way of unraveling once the shooting starts. Our job was logistics drop, shoreline supply, stabilization, fancy way of saying get the gear where it needs to go before somebody dies without it. And that morning, everything was moving too slow and falling too fast. Half the landing crafts missed their marks. Waves hit harder than expected. Radio lines broke down. Command was scrambling for anything that floated. I was down at the staging line checking straps on a supply pallet when a young lieutenant ran up, red-faced and out of breath. "You're the one who built the rafts, right?" I looked up, confused. "Which version?" He waved a clipboard like it owed him money. "The one they're calling B3 Low Silhouette Rig. The one with the stitched canvas and internal float drums. That was mine, even if the name wasn't." I nodded. "Yeah, I know it." "Good. We've got 2 stuck recon teams past the bluff. They're cut off. Can't get a boat in. But we've got 3 of your things left in the stack." He pointed behind him, and sure enough, there they were, covered in tarp, tagged non-priority. Funny how non-priority becomes urgent real quick once it's your men on the other side. Next thing I know, I'm hauling a raft onto a flatbed with 4 other guys who'd never paddled a day in their lives. None of them said much. Didn't have to. We all knew this wasn't rehearsal. By the time we got to the inlet, it was chaos. Water churning, bullets somewhere in the distance, medics shouting behind sand dunes, and somebody's helmet floating upside down like a question nobody wanted to answer. The team was 300 yards out, pinned behind debris. Radio said they had wounded. No way back unless something slipped through low and quiet. That's when the sergeant pointed at me. "You know the rig. You steer." So I did. We pushed off at 0807. No noise, no motor, just 4 paddles and me in the rear, guiding the line like it was my grandmother's porch swing. I didn't think about what could go wrong, didn't have the room. Just watched the shoreline creep closer. Broken trees, tangled wire, bodies that looked like shadows in the sand. And then we reached them. 6 men. 1 barely conscious, 1 holding pressure on his own leg with a torn sleeve. They didn't ask who we were. They just climbed in. The trip back was slower. Weight shifted. 1 man passed out halfway through. I shouted to adjust trim. They listened. We corrected. Raft dipped. Held. And finally dragged ashore with barely enough energy to lift the front over the last wave. No one cheered. No one clapped. They just took the wounded, nodded once, and ran to the next task. That's how it goes. You float, you land, you move. Later that afternoon, I found the same raft, torn, warped, still dripping, propped against a wall near the med tent. Someone had scrawled "Saved 6" on the canvas with chalk. That was all. No unit, no date, just 3 words, and they meant more than any memo. Back at camp, I tried to return to my regular duty, whatever that even meant now. But something had shifted. Officers stopped calling me resource, started calling me asset. That's not respect, but it's a start. Then came the knock on my tent. 2 men in civilian coats, engineers, said they were reviewing post-op innovation performance. Translation: they wanted to know how the raft worked, how it held, what it cost, and how fast they could replicate it. I told them everything, with one condition: no changes, unless you field test it first, in real water, with real load. They paused, took it down, and for the first time, one of them asked for my name twice. Weeks passed. Battlefronts moved. Men came back, limping or not at all. The war didn't slow down just because we got one thing right. But little by little, I saw my rig in places it wasn't supposed to be. Shore patrols, river crossings, medical evacuations. No banner, no feature article. But you could tell by the stitch pattern. That zigzag was mine. By fall, I got a commendation. Not public, not even formal. Just a signed letter from a colonel that said, "Field contribution noted. Impact significant. Stay the course. No medal, no promotion." But I kept the letter. Still have it. Years later, long after the uniform was folded and boxed, I took my grandson to a war museum. They had a section on innovations, boats, jeeps, radios. And there, behind glass, a familiar rig, canvas, steel, same old bones, labeled Prototype Low Silhouette Recovery Platform, unknown designer. He asked if I knew who made it. I looked at him and smiled. "No idea," I said, but he saw the way I looked at it. And he knew. The war moved on. So did the people. But the work, it stayed, quiet, effective, and very real. Some stories don't need a headline, just a truth that floats.